goddamn get it on, will ya? Woo. When the blow up now, everybody's so unusual with it. Shit. But said times in his rhymes, cause his memories, we running through.
Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be going over the BMW N51, N52 engine diagnostics, trouble codes, and everything you need to know regarding this engine. Now, there's a lot of speculation about this engine, and a lot of people don't even know what they're actually talking about when it comes to the N52 engine. So today I'm going to be going over everything that you guys need to know and the problems it will cause and how to resolve these issues on your BMW N52 engine. Okay guys, so we're here now with the N52 engine, and we're going to run over all the N52, N51 engine diagnostics and trouble codes that these cars are going to actually cause you, and why a lot of you are still having issues with your N52 engine still today. Now, the majority of the things can easily be fixed, but a lot of people take it to garages. They will use the wrong scanner or a cheap scanner and misdiagnose these cars, and then they get taken for having a bad car or telling them to need a new engine or this and that, as many of you guys are already aware of the situation. Now, this BMW is like no other. All BMWs are tore apart and people badmouth them, but I'm going to explain to you all the symptoms and the problems that come with having these parts actually failing. So the first one, which sits right down here, which is located down here, are the valve solenoids. Now, they are responsible for keeping the oil up to the adjusters to advance the timing of the valves. Now, when they're incorrectly misdiagnosed, people will believe that it's the camshaft position sensor which sit here, and they very rarely fail. But this is the code a lot of people get on their cheap scanners, and they say that this is failing, and they end up changing that, and they still end up with their codes. The codes being 2A97 and 2A98 or 2A88, 2A87, or P0141, P0142, and it will say camshaft correlation error. They are not your camshaft position sensors. That will be your valve solenoids. If you're using a cheap scanner and you can't seem to diagnose it, that's because it can't read the faults for the valve solenoids, because them scanners are only designed to tell you a certain amount of information. That's why you need a generic scanner like ISTA or an Autel, which will tell you the exact fault. Solenoids are responsible for a lot of the causes of why people's car is not running correctly. For instance, if your car is surging, if you are not getting power when you push on the throttle, wide open throttle, and you feel it like the car's not moving, or you're not getting the power that you're actually requesting from the throttle, it will be your valve solenoids. Because there's a lot of you as well, when you start your car up, you'll realize there's a rough idle. A lot of that's to do with the valve solenoids. A lot of that's to do with another issue we're going to come on to later on. But the majority of the time, it will be your valve solenoids which are here, which are causing your rough idle, your hesitation, your car's idle to bounce all over the place when you first start it from cold, or when you start it from warm. It varies differently about what's happening. Or you're not getting power. Sometimes the power's coming in and then cutting, power's coming in and cutting. A lot of it will be your valve solenoids. The next one that's misdiagnosed a lot is the oil in the coolant reservoir, which sits right here. Now, if you have oil in your coolant reservoir, a lot of people, especially when you take it to garages, seem to think it's a head gasket failure. It is not a head gasket failure on these cars, and this is how people end up misdiagnosing them and telling you need a new engine, and then spending money that wasn't actually needed. If you've got oil in your coolant, these don't suffer with head gasket failure, and they don't suffer with the bolts being pulled out either. It's very misconcepted on it, and it very rarely happens. Same like people seem to think the timing chain fails on these, which they don't. If you have oil in your coolant, it will be from your oil filter housing here, which is the oil filter housing unit, and also your oil cooler, where it's mixing together, where the gaskets have just worn out and they're leaking past and meeting with each other, i.e. returning back to the coolant expansion tank. Now, if you do have a leak, I'd advise you to look down the side of your block here, because what ends up happening is this oil filter housing, the coolant and oil will leak straight down here onto your engine block, and that's why a lot of you end up thinking you've got a coolant leak. Most of the coolant leaks are coming from the oil filter housing, where the gaskets have gone, and then they're leaking straight onto your engine block. Be sure to actually check that, because a lot of the time it will be your oil filter housing gasket that's actually leaking, because the coolant and the oil actually mix together here, and it's got passages. If they end up mixing together, it will go into your coolant reservoir, and then you'll take it to the garage because you think you're losing coolant, when the actual cause is actually this. I've got many videos up showing you how to repair that, and I will put it above the video here if you guys don't know how to get to it. It's a very, very simple job. If you do have that issue, this will be the main culprit of why you've got coolant loss. Make sure to actually change that, and it's not hard to actually do either. It's a very, very cheap job. Just make sure you use a genuine BMW part, and it will resolve all your issues. So the next one, I ask a lot of you, how many of you have had a misfire on cylinder 1, 2 or 3, and you've thought it was something else, changed the spark plug, changed your coil, and you still got a misfire? Well, that's a common misconception, because what ends up happening here is oil ends up leaking into the ignition coils itself from the Valvetronic motor still leaking, and it's a common problem where the Valvetronic motor actually sits and it will end up leaking into your ignition coils, into the wells. Now, to get that out, you need to change obviously the valve cover and clean out all the oil. But another common cause is that if you're experiencing like a stutter, a wide open throttle where it's stuttering, it could be one of your ignition coils on the way out. Now, bear in mind that these cars don't always throw a light for a bad ignition coil. They're very, very smart, and they don't always throw a light. For a misfire, it will lead you to other things when it's actually an ignition coil and it's way out and you won't even know what to do, because a lot of the time these don't show on diagnosis that they've actually got a misfire from an ignition coil itself. The majority of the time the ignition coils go out and don't give no warning and don't give no light, don't give no EML light whatsoever, only when you're trying to pull it on under heavy load. So for instance, from second gear, if you try and shift it into fifth or sixth, you put it on heavy load, it will throw an EML light saying it's got a misfire, and that's the only way you'd get your misfire to actually show up on what cylinder. But the majority of the time it's the spark plugs and ignition coils getting coated in oil and getting destroyed from oil leaking from the Valvetronic motor seal, which sits obviously under here. You guys will see that in my other video, and then it leaks down into the ignition coils itself, actually killing them off. So make sure that you actually check them, because if you have got a misfire and you can feel it stuttering when you actually slam on the cylinder and it stutters, or you feel like a jerking, it will be ignition coil. But as I said, always relate back to the solenoid as well and the ignition coils, because both of them can do the same, because they're both to do with the power and the fuel burning ratio as well. One's for advanced timing, the other one's to burn actually the fuel, then there's the combustion chamber. Next one on these is about oil burning. Now, if a lot of you guys end up smelling oil in your cabin, or you've got a strong oil smell, it will usually be your valve cover gasket, which is right there. Now, as you see, these use aluminium torque to yield bolts. What ends up happening over time is they end up coming loose and they end up breaking. Sometimes they even break in the head, and they can be removed very easily with like a pick, but a lot of the time they end up breaking, causing you to leak oil. And a lot of the time why your valve cover actually ruptures and pops, which is a known fact on here, is to do with the other problem which we're going to go over in a second. But if your valve cover is actually leaking, you will smell oil, because what ends up happening is the oil is actually leaking down onto the exhaust manifold, causing it to actually go into the cabin, because you're smelling oil being dropped onto that exhaust manifold right underneath, as you see there, and they actually burn off there and then enter the cabin via the vents, and then that's why you're actually smelling your oil burning smell constantly on these cars. That brings me to my next one, which is the one that actually pops the valve covers on these, which is the crankcase ventilation, as you'll see right down there under the manifold. We have replaced this. I've got a video showing you how to actually do that. This CCV is actually different to the ones with the black N52 cover, as many of you guys will actually have. This one here is actually a round one, a round ball, and it actually got a lot of different vacuum lines running, because actually it's got the disas, which again we'll move on to after. But them CCVs are actually very easy to change and very cheap to actually change as well. A lot of you guys with the black cover, you're going to have like a wire pipe which actually connects here and back to the valve cover. Now, if you are going to take this off, I would recommend getting a new CCV, because these are going to break all the hoses anyway, and they've got little heater outlets on them that connect up, which actually preheat the CCV before you drive off, to get the car up to temperature quicker, and obviously not to destroy the valve cover. Because as you guys know, when these actually rupture, they put that extra pressure into the crankcase, actually popping the valve cover, and that's the whole reason why your valve covers end up leaking, causing you to actually smell that burned oil smell. The next one on these is your disa valves. Now, the disa valves, I've spoke about them quite a lot. Now, they're not notorious for giving codes at all, and they are not responsible for giving an engine management light. A lot of people seem to think an engine management light will come on when they actually fail. That's just simply not the case. When they actually fail, which are located right there, and you'll see another one located under there, under the manifold as well, because it's a 3-stage intake, you'll end up with feeling no torque and no power. And this is why I said make sure to actually check it, because you actually won't know which actually is wrong. It could be your solenoids, it could be a ignition coil, it could actually be your disas if you've got them. Now, if your disas go bad, they won't throw a full code, and there's also a possibility of your flap actually coming off in the disa, and the pin letting go and getting sucked into your combustion chamber and getting completely destroying the engine. So if you do have disas, make sure to check the flaps on them, make sure to actually check the disa, because they will actually destroy your engine if the flap actually comes off on a pin. A lot of the other problems on these is they get stuck, as well, which the flap becomes completely stuck, where it gets gunked up with oil from the crankcase breather actually failing and spitting the oil back into the manifold, dumping too much oil into the manifold, which actually kills off your disa valves as well. So I would recommend to actually check your disas if you are having issues as well with low down power or loss of torque on the car, because the disas will end up sticking, and the only way to actually diagnose them is to get a scanner. They don't throw an EML light, so if a lot of you guys are going to wait for an EML light, it's not going to happen. They're not, the BMW set them like that because the way they see it, there wasn't actually needed for the whole power of the car and actually to keep the car running perfectly. They're only needed for the torque. They're manifold runners, as maybe we can call it. They're to adjust the air in the intake itself. Now they are a known weak point, and I have changed them when I first purchased this car, as many of you guys already know. That's why it's got a different car on one of mine, because I purchased that from like a low mileage E90, but the other one I bought brand new, the small one. I replaced both of them, and like I said, because I saw one full code film and I replaced them both because this car wasn't running at its maximum power, and I knew straight away that it was to do the disas. We replaced them, and now the car's back at full power. If a lot of you haven't done that, I would recommend to go and change them, because it's a very, very overlooked subject, and a lot of the reason why you guys actually driving around with no engine management light and you don't know what's happening could probably be your disa valves, and that's what's causing you to lose low down power. And these things actually drag when the disa valve's actually gone bad, because of the fact you don't have the power from the disas actually giving you the torque. Now the code they'll actually give is the throttle valve servo flap failed, and that's constant oil say stuck open, which is usually disa valve where the flap is stuck open. But be sure to check to make sure it actually ain't fell out in your inlet manifold. And a lot of people message me and tell me, even on Instagram, and send me photos showing that they checked their manifold, and thanks to my videos I saved them, because the flap was actually, they found it in their manifold just hanging around in there. So be sure to actually check them, because you don't want that getting into your engine. Now the next one that sits down here, guys, if you can see, is all your belts and pulleys. Now these are known when the oil filter housing itself, which sits right there, ends up leaking oil, and the oil cooler, they'll leak onto your belts, which can end up derailing your belt and the belt getting sucked into the sump. They also are known to leak oil and go onto the tensioner, and then the tensioner will not hold, which can end up derailing your belt. Also, what ends up happening, the tensioner needs you to torque to your old bolt in the block. They end up working their way loose and end up letting go of the belt. I know this has happened to many people. It nearly ended up happening to me. I did change out all my belts and all my pulleys on this car, and I do recommend, if you guys haven't replaced your belts, to go and replace them, because the tensioner does let go, and so does the belt as well, and it will get sucked into the sump and actually destroy your whole engine. So therefore, if you've had an oil filter housing gasket leak, or your oil cord is leaked, I do recommend to change the belt and change the tensioner as well, because the belts end up coming loose and they will leak oil onto the pulley itself and completely derail everything, and it can actually destroy your engine. I've known many people where the belt's been sucked in and it's actually destroyed all their engine and completely destroyed it just from that belt coming off. So be sure to actually check them. I do have videos up showing you how to actually do that. It's very, very simple on this car to be able to replace all the belts, tensioner and the pulleys. The next one on these, which a lot of you guys already are fully aware of, especially in the US regarding this failure, is the Vanos check valves. Now if you are still getting codes, there's Vanos check valves which live right down here under the block. A lot of you already know where they are. Now if you've changed the solenoids and you're still getting codes, I recommend to take the Vanos check valves out and actually clean them out. You will not need to replace them with new ones. Just make sure you take them out and actually clean them. Now I've never actually had to do that, because majority of the time it's always been the solenoids at fault. But a lot of people, they do get gunked up, especially if the car has lived by the life cycle of long oil changes every 16,000 miles. Then filters will be completely gunked up, and therefore you will need to actually clean them out and actually probably even change them, depending on how severely clogged they are. They don't really clog, and everyone I know who's ever took them out has said they weren't really bad, this, that, the other, and therefore they've never had to change them. They've only had to change the solenoids and their cars come back to full power. But it all works differently for different people. Just make sure you actually check them. They're not hard to get to, and you can get to them. So if they are bad, make sure to actually be thorough and actually check it. And if they are, then just replace them. Now the next one that lives down here is the water pump and thermostat. Now many of you guys message me every day regarding this issue. If your water pump or thermostat is sticking, your fan right here will actually stay on, and you'll hear this actually whirring away constantly, and you'll hear it very, very loud. That's if the water pump speed actually slows down to keep the car actually cool. Then your fan will come on to actually keep the car cool, because the water pump is doing its job. So if your fan's actually coming on, it means your water pump is near to failure. And if you scan your car, you'll probably have a water pump variation code for speed. change out your water pump and your thermostat, because the last thing you want is your car to actually overheat and actually disrupt all the cooling system, and you'll have to replace every single thing inside the car. The coolant reservoir is another thing I do recommend to actually replace if you're going to replace the whole cooling system, because they will probably crack, especially in the US due to the prone heat. And obviously if your cooling system actually overheats, it's going to crack that reservoir, so it's better to replace that before it get any later and it actually you replace everything, and the next thing down the line that actually cracks, you cause another coolant system leak, and then you're back to having to fit another water pump. Because if many of you guys don't know, if you let the water pump run dry, it will just destroy itself again. And that's many of the times why a lot of people end up destroying them. It's from actually just bleeding the cooling system. When they first get the car, they want to change the cooling system. What they don't understand is playing about that water pump, putting a self bleed, is actually knackering out the motor and actually knacking out the propeller. So that's why I advise against it, and not to actually sit there actually bleeding the system constantly, because it's going to do nothing for you apart from put you in debt with water pumps galore constantly. Now this car is on nearly 170k on its original water pump and thermostat, and I tell you guys all the time, and that's because I look after this car, I look after it properly. The coolant's actually perfect. Now when you change the oil filter housing gasket, you're going to lose coolant, therefore you just have to re-top up. It's very, very simple, and you're going to need to top up anyway, because you're going to lose probably the whole overflow tank, therefore you're going to have to re-top it up. So really you're getting new coolant in there anyway, so it doesn't make sense to actually keep changing it. And also when you actually drain the coolant from the oil filter housing, you won't actually need to bleed the system. These systems self-bleed themselves, so you won't have to actually do that. Now the next thing I get asked all the time is a lot of people change their ignition coils on their car, on their N52, and then don't realize why their car isn't starting. Now a lot of these people are not aware that when you take off the ignition coils, you'll see this little block that goes up here as well, especially when you remove the valve cover, which is common. You remove the valve cover and there's all this plastic junction box for all the wires that distribute to all the ignition coils, has got this ground strap right here. Now a lot of people never seem to put this back. Now as you see, it's hooked onto the chassis, and it hooks onto the actual ignition circuit block for the ignition coils as well. You have to remember what bolt that goes through. Now a lot of people, and I've seen this many times, end up putting this strap to these torque bolts right here. You cannot do that. It has to go back up here. It has to keep the ignition coils grounded at all times from that strap, and that way it doesn't overflow or give too much current. So do make sure that this strap is actually connected up when you actually take your ignition coils out or you change your valve cover, because without that strap your car will not start, and you'll have it cranked but it will not start at all. Now the next one I want to talk about, and lastly on the N52 engine, is the life-saving modules update that I swear by, and that's how a lot of you guys actually found me for the N52. And I've done this for many people, hundreds and hundreds of people all across the US, UK, and many people still thank me today for updating their cars. Now if many of you guys don't know, if you still got the rough idle, there was a problem with the firmware when these cars were released to do with the Vanos solenoids. When these cars are new, emissions are strict because they have to meet the new emission standards for the certain 3 years to make these cars be able to be sold, and also be able to get low road tax, and for all the government guidelines and obviously the country's guidelines to meet the emission regulations every year. Now after 3 years goes on, emissions can be de-restricted and the car can actually come to full power, because they're not needed to meet the emission regulations. Because as you guys know, if a car is checked by the government or by VOSA on the roads, or anybody who checks for the emissions to make sure the car is actually meeting emissions, hence why they bring out the N51 in the US for the SULEV, which is a super ultra low emissions vehicle. This is what they did on the N52. Now on the N52, on the magnesium cover, and the same for the black valve cover, there was restrictions in place, and the new software actually programs it to actually de-restrict the emissions, and it makes this car an absolute pleasure to drive. There's also an update for the gearbox on the N52, which completely changes the drive of the whole car. Now a lot of people ain't even aware of that, but as I said, I've done it for many people, and I'm sure many will comment who's actually had it done and their cars actually drive like a dream. A lot of people go and change the solenoids and still get the rough idle, and a lot of that, as I said, is the update alone, and the update will cure most of a lot of you guys issues that you're having with your N52 engine. And it also applies for the N53 as well. If you have got issues with your N53 engine, that will completely transform your N53 engine, especially if you've got the rough idle, because then a lot of you are going to watch this who've got N53, and most of this actually does apply to you. There's also a lot of people who are going to say, oh, I've got the 272 bhp version of the N52. No, you do not. There is no such thing as the 272 bhp version. It was only 265 bhp, and that was in a 130i. If you have a 272 bhp version, you have an N53. Take your valve cover off and go and have a look. You have high pressure injectors which are sitting right underneath your valve cover. You will not have an N52 engine. Yes, you'll have the 3-stage manifold with the 2 disas. Yes, you'll have the oil filter housing. Yes, you'll have the valve solenoids, but you do not have an N52 engine. If you have a black valve cover, you've got the N52N. A lot of you always keep getting this confused. N52N uses a black valve cover, but so does N53. The only difference is N53 is direct injected. The N52N and the N52 is normal injection system. The N53 runs like the N54 on a direct injection system. So please, if any of you are going to try and come here and tell me that they made a 272 bhp version, you're out of your goddamn mind, because I know these engines like the back of my hand, and they never ever made a 272 bhp version. 272 bhp version is N53, which can be seen all online as well on Wikipedia. Need I say more regarding this engine? I know this engine very, very well, and a lot of you guys already know that. So I hope this actually clears up a lot of issues that a lot of you are actually having with the N52. And as I said, if all else actually fails with your van or solenoid and ignition coils, I can do the update remotely for you, so do come to me and I can actually sort that for you. Okay guys, as you've just seen there, I've just gone over the N51, N52 engine diagnostics and everything you need to know regarding this engine. Now I know this video is very long-winded, but that's because there is a lot on the N52 you have to bear in mind. Now this does apply as well if you're in the market to plan to go and buy one as well. Now this does apply to the 328i, 330i's, any car with the N52 engine. It doesn't matter if you've got a black valve cover. If you have a black valve cover, the only difference with that is you're going to have a different CCV, which is the Y-pipe one, and you're not going to have the 3-stage manifold. But please actually check that, because certain models, certain years, it all changes and it varies. For instance, the N51 does have the 3-stage manifold. Anywhere else in the US doesn't actually get that, so it's all varies. If you've got an N51 engine, you will have it, and if you've got the magnesium valve cover or the silver valve cover like I have, you will definitely have the 3-stage manifold as well, providing if anything under 07, you'll have the 3-stage manifold. As I said, all these problems can be addressed, and if you are still having issues and you do need the update, then please contact me on my email address and I'll be able to help you, or add me on Instagram and I'll be able to help you there. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope it's going to help a lot of you guys with your problems with your N52 engine. Thank you very much for watching. It's BMW Dr. Dean here, and goodbye.